All rise. The court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Mark Lemieux presiding.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please be seated. Brought this binder out just to make me look smart. No?
You look smart already.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back on the record. This is State of New Jersey versus Paul Caneiro. It's indictment 19-02-0283. Can I have the appearances of counsel for the record?
Good morning, Your Honor. Assistant Prosecutor Nicole Wallace on behalf of the state.
Good morning, Judge Chris Decker, Assistant Monmouth County Prosecutor for the state.
Good morning, Monica Maskell on behalf of Mr. Paul Caneiro, who's present.
Good morning.
Good morning, Andy Murray, Mr. Caneiro.
All right, good morning. And good morning, Mr. Caneiro. All right, we are now ready to start the summations. With that, we go in reverse order. We will start with the defense. Go ahead.
Just have this table. Just dim the lights, or maybe just a little bit so the PowerPoint shows. Just, yeah, that's it. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning.
Thank you. The state has the wrong man. Paul Caneiro is missing. The evidence, the facts, and the lack of information that we have in this case support that conclusion. They support a finding of not guilty in this case. And I'm going to spend some time explaining why. As I told you from the beginning, this case is about tunnel vision, it's about confirmation bias, and it's about proving a hypothesis. And I'm going to ask you to recall the testimony, the testimony of expert witness John Lightbody and expert witness Detective Cordoma, who testified about how precise the scientific method is. They explained to you that when they are trying to ascertain how a fire started, when they're trying to collect a conclusion or establish a conclusion, they engage in a very distinct methodology. And that methodology is not choosing a hypothesis and then taking the steps to prove it. It's actually the opposite. They establish multiple hypotheses, and then they take the steps to disprove all of them until they're left with one. And the reason they do that is because oftentimes, or at least sometimes, the evidence isn't clear at first. Sometimes two things can be true or potentially true at once. And as a result, experts such as Mr. Lightbody and Mr. Detective Cordoma, sneak preview. Sometimes two things can be true at once, and you have to take the necessary and the required steps to make sure that you're not being misled by the evidence in front of you, or confused, or perhaps just too focused on one thing and ignoring something else. And these experts told you what their methodology was specifically. They go to the location and they start in the exterior and they do a whole observation of the exterior and they look to see if anything's out of place or what's going on. Then they go inside and they start, I think they said like the furthest point away from where potentially could be an origin. Or they go through certain floors and they end up where it appears to be the fire, closest to where the fire started. And they look at all sorts of things and they rule out, is it electric? Is it gas? Is it this? Is it that? And ultimately, when they're able to rule out these other hypotheses. That's how they know that they have arrived at the correct conclusion. And in this case, when it came to the investigation itself, and I don't mean the arson investigation specifically, and I don't mean the ballistics, I mean the investigation. I mean the case itself, and determining who did this. There were no multiple hypotheses. There were no multiple theories. There was nothing ruled out. What they did was exactly what Detective Petrozello told you toward the end of his testimony. They followed the evidence. They followed the evidence that landed on their lap, and they focused on it, and yes, it pointed to Paul. But a failure to look for evidence, a failure to collect evidence, and a failure to preserve certain evidence can, and I submit to you did in this case, ultimately lead to the wrong conclusion. November 20th of 2018. It was 7 years ago, 3 months, and some days. To be exact, it was 2,641 days and 63,480 hours. And I ask that you keep that in mind. I ask that you keep in mind how much time has passed since the beginning of this investigation. Now, I talk to all of you folks first, and then the state gets up and they respond. I don't know what they're going to say. We all sat through the same trial, so I have a pretty good guess of what I think they're going to say, and I'm going to work off of that. I don't know if I'll think of everything that they ultimately submit to you. But I also want to note the reason why I don't know everything that they're going to say to you is because, as the judge will instruct you, a closing argument is just that. It is an argument. And ultimately, the evidence that all of you heard and saw and observed, that's what controls. So when the prosecutor gets up here and tells his story, which I think will go something like this, the prosecutor will tell you that on November 19th of 2018, Paul Caneiro was in some sort of argument with his brother. His brother, Keith, was upset about money missing from the trust, and you heard the phone calls between Keith and Paul, but you only heard Keith's side. You didn't really hear Paul's side, but you heard a little bit of Paul's side. Because you heard Keith's reaction. And you heard Keith talking to Paul and saying, Paul, wake up, I want to log into this account, get me the login. And the state, I suspect, will tell you that for whatever reason, that prompted Paul Caneiro to be concerned. And the state told you in their opening argument that Paul Caneiro's finances was a house of cards. And I'm going to address that shortly. They're going to tell you, I suspect, that Paul Caneiro was at some level of financial desperation, where it was the perfect storm, I suppose, between his financial situation that they theorize and the fact that Keith was upset with him that night. They're going to tell you that, I guess a few hours later, after that phone call in the early morning hours, that Paul Caneiro turned off his surveillance system, and that he did so because he was about to commit these horrendous crimes. They're going to tell you that he left his house and drove to Keith Caneiro's house, and that from point A to point B, even though we don't have surveillance from point A to point B, they're going to submit to you that it was Paul Caneiro driving, and that he arrives at 15 Willow Brook, and the tragedy ensues. And they're going to tell you that Mr. Caneiro used a gun and used a knife to kill his family members. And then they're going to tell you that Mr. Caneiro went back home and took evidence with him, bloody clothes, put it in his basement, and lit his house on fire. Left the gas can on the front lawn. They're going to tell you things about the gun, that the gun was separated from the barrel. The gun is in the gun safe in his basement. The barrel's in a bag found in the car later. And they're going to tell you that Mr. Caneiro did all of that, I suspect, to make it seem like he himself was also a victim. That it was some elaborate, poor thought out plan that he concocted that night after a phone call with Keith Caneiro. I'm going to tell you why that is simply not true. See, the state is working off of pieces. You heard a lot of testimony from many different witnesses. And not a single one of them could tell you that story. The state is piecing together puzzle pieces and trying to create a picture of what happened, or what they think happened. But the pieces don't exactly fit. They just don't. There's things that don't make sense. And if you recall the testimony that we heard from approximately 50 witnesses. First, we heard from Guli Basu. She told you about the contract negotiations with Doris Duke. She didn't tell you anything bad about Paul Caneiro. She certainly didn't tell you that Paul Caneiro was responsible for this murder. We heard from Stephen Weinstein and Ron Artigas, who were the accountant and insurance broker for Keith and Paul, the Caneiro brothers. And they just told you some background information about what was going on with the businesses and the accounting and how money flowed within the businesses and the insurance policies that they had. They didn't tell you anything bad about Paul. They didn't tell you that Paul murdered his brother or his brother's family. In fact, then we heard from Ben Palaucci. And Mr. Palaucci, who took the stand, said he was a friend of Keith's, and he was aware that Keith was a little upset with Paul. I think he said 6 months prior, which is maybe June or so, close to April. And he mentioned about it was something about money, which aligns with what happened in April, which we'll talk about. But he also said after that conversation, somewhere between April and June, or 6 months prior to November, that everything was fine. Everything was copacetic. He agreed with that. He said that they went out to lunch, he saw them all the time, he would see Keith all the time, and when he saw Keith, sometimes Paul would be there, and everything was normal, everything was fine. He told you that the day that Keith learned that Keith's house was on fire, the first person he contacted was Paul. And he said, Paul, you gotta get to your brother's house. Your brother's house is on fire. And Paul tried to explain to him, I can't, my own house was on fire and I'm at the police station. And Ben is urging Paul to get there. Why? Because Ben knows that Paul is his person. Because Ben knows that if anyone cared that Keith's house was on fire or should be there or would want to be there, it's Paul. He didn't even have Corey's number. The other brother. I'll put that aside for a moment. I want to focus on how close Keith and Paul were. Detective Bassiter testified next. She was the financial detective. We're going to talk about really the heart of her testimony momentarily. but her testimony was simply about finances. And it was more specifically about what she focused on with respect to the finances. It wasn't a full story. We heard from Heather Kapp and Jonathan Harrington. Those were very interesting witnesses because they told you, and again, we'll talk about this, that they saw two people. Well, let me back up. Heather Kapp said that she heard and saw two people outside of Paul's home at 4:30 a.m. She was very precise and specific about the time. And Jonathan Harrington told all of you that he heard two men outside of Paul's home at approximately 4:30. Not precisely, but approximately. And they told you that they didn't know who these men were, but it's very interesting that they both heard/saw the two men at around the same time, and it was a half hour before the fire. Then we heard from Officer Marino, Officer Redmond, and Officer Bernhard. Those were the first responding officers to Paul's house at 27 Tilton Drive that day. And they just told you what they saw. They told you about the suspicious things that they observed, the gas can on the lawn, the burn mark on the car, near the gas can, near the garage. They told you about how it was a suspicious scene, and one officer saw a couple of footprints. It was essentially the backdrop to what started the arson investigation. It was clear, the testimony made it clear, that it was clear to these officers pretty quickly after they arrived on scene that this was an arson. The gas can gave it away. The fact that there was two separate fires on opposite ends of the house gave it away. The burn mark on the car gave it away. And that's what their testimony was about. They couldn't tell you who started the fire. They talked a little bit about their conversations with Mr. Caneiro when they arrived on scene. We'll talk about that. But they did not offer any of you any information as to who started these fires, or more importantly, who committed the crimes. We heard from Chris Sorrentino, the first responder. He was a fireman who happened to live around the corner, and he was there pretty much within minutes. And he just told you he tried to put out the fire. We heard from Fire Marshal Flanagan. We'll talk about him later, but he certainly didn't tell you who started the fire. We heard from Catherine Lachise, who was a 911 caller at Keith's house, 15 Willow Brook. And she basically just told you she saw the smoke, she called 911. She has no idea who started the fire. Detective Brady, he was the detective from Ocean Township at Paul's house that day. He spoke to Paul. Paul cooperated with him in numerous respects. Again, we'll talk about that later. But he didn't tell you who started the fire. He didn't tell you who committed these crimes. He told you about his role in the entire investigation, which was fairly limited to specifically Ocean Township. He really didn't have anything to do with Colts Neck. We heard from Officer Mazzicola, who was the first responding officer at 15 Willowbrook. And he explained that when he first got there, he pulled in the driveway. We saw, I think, his MVR, his motor vehicle recording. He goes up to the house. He's trying to see what's going on. Told you about his initial observations. Another piece of the puzzle, but nothing directly leading to Paul. We heard from Detective Zarillo. He was the lead detective. He was Detective Brady's counterpart in Colts Neck. And he told you about his role in the Colts Neck investigation and what he contributed to the investigation. He did things. He helped out. He investigated. We heard it. But he can't tell you that Paul Caneiro committed this murder. These murders. These crimes. We heard from Boris Wolstein, who was another 911 caller. We're going to talk about him in just a little bit too. But he's a 911 caller. Another piece of the puzzle. We heard from Giselle Restrepo, friend of Paul's. She had good things to say about Paul. She said he was a good friend. She said she didn't have anything bad to say about him. He was always very helpful. She had a good relationship with him. She certainly didn't tell you that Paul Caneiro was capable of these crimes. We heard from Carmelo, who's a firefighter, who had a very limited role. He fought the fire at 15 Willow Brook, and unfortunately he had to remove Sophia's body. But he doesn't know how Sophia's body got there. He doesn't know who's responsible. We heard from Tyler Badaracco, another firefighter. I think mostly about the generator. That's all. We heard from Detective Mahoney and Detective Weisbrot, and they talked a lot about surveillance videos, and they discussed what you could see on the surveillance videos, and we're going to talk about that also. The surveillance videos are interesting because they're probative and they're compelling in a way, but they do not show you who committed these crimes. We heard from Detective Gropura, again, the arson investigator. He determined it's an arson. He doesn't determine by who. We heard from Detective Catalona. He processed the scene at Paul's house, and Detective Vogt, who processed the scene at 15 Willowbrook. They collected evidence. They didn't draw any conclusions. We heard from, again, John Lightbody, determined it was an arson at Paul's house. No surprise there. Doesn't tell you who, can't tell you who. We heard from Detective Miglorisi. He did the phone extractions and he read messages to you. That was his primary role in this case. And he gave you some background information about the communications, some communications, a few communications, 3 occasions specifically, April, September, and November, out of an entire year. And you heard testimony that they talked every day, whether by text, by phone, by email, by message, by anything, in person. And you heard text messages between the 2 brothers from 3 of those days. We heard from Robert Block, who used to work at Square One with Keith and Paul. He testified about an alert he received about essentially saying the power went out, the servers were down. Also didn't have anything bad to say about Paul. We heard from Trooper Cocking, who had the canine at 27 Tilton. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Again, a limited role. In fact, I think he made that very clear. He's like, I'm just the dog guy. It's a tool. It's an aid in the investigation. Can't tell you anything more than that. We heard from Detective Petrozello, the lead detective in this case. And we're going to talk about him too. He testified about his role in the investigation and things that he did and things that he reviewed. He wasn't there when this happened. There's no eyewitnesses. no one, including the lead detective, can tell you who did this. And then we have all of the DNA people. And again, we're going to talk about that too. We have serology. We have Allison Lane, Judith Link, Chris Symposiak, Teresa Nezazon, Christine Schlenker, Danielle Reed. And the interesting thing about DNA, which again we'll talk about, is that it can tell you, potentially, whether someone's DNA profile is contained or has been deposited in some way on an item, or whether it's more likely, we're talking about likelihood ratios, that the DNA is contained in a mixture versus not contained in a mixture. But every DNA person agreed, every DNA expert, I should say, including our own, explained to you that what DNA does not tell you is the who, what, when, where, or why. DNA can't tell you how the DNA got there. It can't tell you whether there's an innocent explanation or a nefarious explanation. It can't tell you whether it was directly deposited or transferred. It can't tell you if it's contamination. It can't tell you why the DNA is there. It can't tell you the backstory. It's just a fact. And I know that DNA can be compelling, so we will talk about it. We heard from Michael Abraham. He had a very limited role. It was with respect to the electric, 15 Willow Brook. And he assisted in the context of him looking at being an electrical engineer. He assisted Detective Bordoma with determining, ultimately, that 15 Willow Brook was also an arson. Again, no surprise there. We heard from Christopher Clayton, the ballistics expert. And similar to the arson and the DNA, he told you that certain bullets matched bullets, that certain bullets matched a barrel, and that shell casings matched a receiver. He can't tell you who shot the gun. He can't tell you who used the gun. He doesn't know. He's examining this information days, weeks later. He can't tell you that Paul Caneiro is responsible for these crimes. Lastly, we heard from the medical examiners. And that testimony was tragic. It was heart-wrenching. Those medical examiners can only tell you the cause and manner of the death, which we know, which we're not disputing. They can't tell you who killed them. So the state, with all of those pieces, with all of those puzzle pieces, all of those facts, they're going to come up here and tell you a story of what, again, is the theory of what happened. And I just ask that all of you be mindful and keep in mind, what is a fact? What did you actually hear? What did you actually see? What do you actually know as a result of the testimony? Versus what is the argumentative thread that is weaving these pieces together to create a story? What is fact versus what is argument? Now, with that in mind, with the evidence we heard, with what is anticipated the state will argue, and again, I don't know exactly what they're going to say. This is my best guess. These are the reasons to doubt that story. And just remember, we'll talk about this at the end, but it's their burden. They have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond any and all reasonable doubt, that Mr. Caneiro is responsible for these crimes. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to discuss with you is that there are many reasons to doubt. But all you need is one. That's it. The first reason to doubt the state's theory is that Paul loved his family. You heard testimony from Paul's oldest daughter, Katie, that he was closest to his Aunt Jennifer and Uncle Keith, that they weren't extended family, but rather one big family. I asked her, how was he with Jesse and Sophia? And she said, he treated them like he treated me and Marissa, like his own kids. And he would drop everything for us. He'd always be there. He was very supportive. He was just good to have around. And we heard testimony about a special bond between Paul and Jesse, because Paul had 2 daughters. And Jesse was the only boy in the family. And so it was really exciting for Paul to develop a relationship with Jesse. It was like his own son, is what you heard. And Katie explains they had a great relationship. They had a lot of things in common, and Jesse loved history, my dad loves history, so they would do a lot of things like that. And Jesse was learning how to swim. He asked my dad, who I tagged along with, and we watched his little race when he learned to swim. And then one time, I think Jesse was in preschool, he was able to bring a special friend to show off to his class, and he invited my dad, Paul. And they did things together. When Jesse was bored at home, he would call Paul. And either Jesse would get dropped off and spend time with Paul, or they'd go out together, they'd do things, they'd spend time together. They did a lot together, were her words. We saw some photos. Now, to be clear, you heard Katie explain on her direct testimony that there were many photos taken. That's just a sample. I'm not going to stand in front of you all day with many photos. I think you get the gist. Many photos were taken of the family, of the one big family. Now, who is Paul Caneiro? You heard from people that knew him best. You heard from his family members, and you heard from people that were like his family members, family friends that were so close that they considered the Caneiros their family. And you heard that Paul was highly intelligent, very smart. He's very well educated. He's very helpful. He's a friendly, kind, caring man, knowledgeable and level-headed, a loving, family-oriented person, calm, even-tempered, mild-mannered. And that he never really raised his voice, that he wasn't a yeller. He didn't really yell. Not even at his own kids, running around being kids. That just wasn't his temperament. And you heard that he tended to take a more logical approach to things. And you heard from Dr. Gould and his wife Pam, who were neighbors with them for a really long time. You heard from Stacy Pritchett, who is Paul's wife's best friend since high school, has known Paul since they were 16 years old. And you heard from her husband, Jim. These are people that have known the family forever. And they told you how close Paul and Keith were, that they were exceptionally close. Some people will even say they were fused at the hips. They could talk about many different things. They were always joking, laughing. They had a very close, caring relationship. You could just feel that they cared for each other. They spent a lot of time together, obviously working together, but outside of work, they spent a lot of time together as well. And I think that that's something that I would ask that all of you keep that in mind. Because while the state's theory of motive is sort of surrounding the business, what fails to be appreciated is the bigger picture. Because yes, they're brothers. You heard from Katie, they felt like brothers. They were business partners. They had disagreements. You had the opportunity to hear some of them. That never took away from the family dynamic. That was one aspect of their overall relationship, which was largely personal. Brothers were really close. It was the type of love that Jim Pritchett said if he had a brother, he would want that type of love between him and his brother. That's what he observed. They were close, and it was kind of the Caneiro brothers against the world. They were just loyal to one another. They had a very loving relationship. Paul would call Keith his person, his best friend. He was always there for Keith. They were best friends and business partners. And he was very protective of Keith, and he loved him very much. And one of the themes in this case is that Paul had a habit, almost what he felt was like an obligation, it seemed, to always help his brother. His brother wasn't very handy, you heard. If he needed help with something at the house, Paul would be there. If he needed a light bulb change, if he needed help with the pool, if he needed help with this or that, Paul would run over, he would stop over, and he would always help because Paul was the handy one. He knew how to do those things. And the state is going to try to use that against Paul to say, well, Paul, he knew Keith's house, he knew the ins and outs, he knew how to work the electric and the gas, and he knew how to do these things at Keith's house. So that's one more reason why they think he's responsible for the murders. One has nothing to do with the other. And I'm going to talk about that later too. The fact that Paul was a loving, helpful brother and would go to his brother's house at the drop of a dime to help him, that just means he's a good brother. That's what that means. And it means that that's the type of relationship that they had. And Keith could rely on Paul. Like he did when he went back to school. Because when Keith went back to school, Keith was busy. He went to Columbia, a nice school. He had to take classes, he had to study, he had to do the things. And so Paul stepped up, and you heard that he was more involved the day-to-day with the businesses. But you heard he was very supportive of Keith going back to school. And that Keith would even ask Paul for help with his classes. You heard that from Dr. Gould. It wasn't uncommon that Keith would contact Paul, I guess, about classes, things to do if there was a project, for advice. And you also heard Detective Miglorisi tell you that agreed that there was a conversation between Paul and Keith where Keith is asking Paul to help him with a lab assignment that he wasn't able to do it. He tried multiple times, he was having a problem, he couldn't pass it, and so he asked Paul to log in as him and do the assignment, and Paul did it. Paul was 100% supportive. And what was Paul's relationship with Jesse and Sophia? We heard a little bit before from Katie. But Dr. Gould says it's fabulous. By the time Jesse and Sophia were coming around, especially when they were, 8, 12 in that ballpark, it's actually 8 and 11, his children were already in their 20s. They were older. So it was kind of like having kids again. He especially loved Jesse because he had 2 daughters. We talked about that. He could just do things with Jesse that he may not have done with his daughters. But he loved them very much. He kind of spoiled them on the holidays. Paul loved those kids like his own, especially with Jesse. He had a close bond. I know they did lunch dates from time to time. You could just see the bond when they were together. They would just connect. Paul loved Keith and Jen and those children. Jim says, I know Paul loved both of them, like having grown-up daughters. Sophia was just another beautiful little girl, and he loved Jesse. He thought that he was Jim thought he was a calming influence on Jesse. And it seemed that there was just a special bond that the two of them had because he was the only little boy in the group. And Stacy said, I can tell you that he loved them very much. I would say Jesse was the son he didn't have. He loved Jesse, he loved Sophia. He absolutely adored those kids. I know when Jesse was in preschool or kindergarten, he was allowed to bring an adult to school, and he chose his Uncle Paul. And that's how much Jesse loved Paul. And it was absolutely reciprocated. He absolutely loved Jesse. He absolutely loved Sophia. He loved those kids. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that is Uncle Paul. That is Uncle Paul. Now, going a little bit more into the state's evidence, their theory of motive doesn't add up. It literally does not add up. And I told you this in opening, and now I'm going to break it down for you now that we've heard the testimony. So the state told you at the beginning of this case that Paul's financial situation was a house of cards. But what did you actually hear? Now we heard like over a day of testimony from Detective Bassender, and it was a lot of it was a very lengthy breakdown of the financials. Day 2 of her testimony, it was almost like, here's the data. And then day 2 in the morning on cross-examination was more like, now here are the conclusions. But I'm going to start with Gully Bassey for a moment. What did you hear from Gully? That Doris Duke was actively negotiating with Square One at the time of the murders. The murders happened on in the evening of November 19th, going into the early morning hours of November 20th. Only a couple days before that, Keith sent a proposal to Doris Duke. And a few days before that, on the 13th, about a week before the murders, Keith had a meeting with Gully and other members from Doris Duke. And you heard from Gully that they were actively negotiating, that there were certain things that she wanted to change. She wanted 24/7 access. She wanted the costs to come down. And she wanted a more competitive rate. And Keith was working on it, along with Paul. They were working on it together. And Keith sent a proposal, and one of those proposals was a 6-year contract option. It was 4 years with the option to renew an additional 2, which meant that Keith was proposing 2 days, or 3 days technically before the murders, since they happened in the early morning hours. He was proposing that if you accept this contract, Paul and I are going to continue to work with you for the next 6 years. Yes, Keith was applying to jobs. He applied to some jobs with his friend Ben, who worked at Amazon. He was trying to create a backup plan because he was a little worried. Why was Keith worried? You heard it in the messages. He's not on disability. He doesn't have a sure income if things were to ultimately fall through. And Keith you kind of heard he's like a high-strung guy. So he wants a backup plan. He's going to Columbia. He's trying to further his education. He's trying to put himself in the best position, but he also, you heard, lives a nice lifestyle. You saw photos of his home. Ben, his friend, explained to you a little bit about his lifestyle. He had nice cars. You heard he had a nanny named Claudia. Paul had expenses. Keith had expenses. But Paul was on disability. And Keith wasn't. So Keith just wanted to make sure he had a backup plan. What you heard from the witness on the stand is that she only had to renew, or she only had to terminate her contract with Square One after the murders happened. She had to find another vendor. We don't know what would have happened if the murders didn't occur. They could have renewed. You heard from Robert Block, he had no expectation that he was going to lose his job. He assumed he was going to continue working for Square One. There was no indication to one of the main persons who worked in that business, Robert Block, that the business was going to end. The hope was that it would continue, and Keith and Paul were actively working on that. Now they had a second business, a pest control business, EcoStar. And again, there was ongoing negotiations for some time about the sale of EcoStar. They got a pretty good offer at some point. And at some point it was $850,000, and then it was $750,000. And you heard testimony that initially Keith wanted to hold off. He was like, let's try to get $1 million. Because Keith believed that that was feasible. And initially, Steve Weinstein, he testified that he told them, yeah, waiting could help. But then, as we got closer to the December, when the contract with Doris Duke was subject to termination at that point, we don't know, again, active negotiations, but Keith was a little bit pushy at this point, and he's like, you know what, maybe we need to just sell. You know, he's stressed. He's looking again for another backup plan just in case. And Paul's telling him, hold off. We might still get $1 million. We might still get more money. Relax. I think you heard it in the messages. Paul's like, relax, relax. And regardless of whether they sold it for $1 million or whether they sold it for $750,000 or anything in that ballpark, Paul was a 50% owner. That's the one they owned 50-50. So whatever they sold it for, Paul gets half. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if Paul was desperate for money, he would have just sold it. And he would have just said, yeah, okay, Keith, I agree, let's sell it now. Let's get half of $750,000 or $850,000 or whatever it was in that ballpark. Paul was not in a rush for money. That's why he was telling Keith to relax and to wait and see if they could get more, like they originally planned. He was trying to refocus Keith on that original plan. Now, in addition to the potential income, if Doris Duke renewed with the company, Square One, and in addition to the potential to gain funds from the sale of EcoStar, Paul is on disability. This was the testimony of Detective Bassender. He was making $232,292 in disability alone. And Detective Bassender agreed that was a significant amount of money. It covered his expenses. And here's the interesting thing, because he had 3 different disability insurance policies. You heard Ron Artigas testify. These were like kind of sophisticated insurance guys. They knew a little bit more about insurance than the average person, and they were well insured. So he had an Unum disability policy where he would make $9,490 a month. Then he had a Sun Life disability policy where he earned $7,430 a month. And from Social Security, he earned $2,446 a month. Now, what happened is that payments from one of those insurance policies, they had temporarily stopped from June 2017 to November of 2018. Detective Bassender testified about that. And the reason is because he had received some sort of like lump sum, and it was like an overpayment, so to compensate for that, the insurance company said, we're gonna pause your payments for a period of time. But once those payments caught up, and once the lack of payments amounted to the original overpayment, starting December 20th, a month after this happened, the next month, a few weeks into the next month, Paul was going to get that additional money. He was going to get $7,430 each month. He was about to make more money a few weeks before the murder. So we have the income from the disability, potential proceeds from EcoStar sale, which is a lot of money, and the income from Square One if Doris Duke renewed the contract. Paul, who loved his family, he had no motive. This does not add up to a motive. This does not add up to desperation. This does not add up to a sudden change. He goes from being loving and caring and kind and helpful, a wonderful brother, a wonderful uncle, just like that, and he horrendously murders his entire family. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make sense. Not with this math. And Detective Bassender testified that his fixed utilities versus his expenses. And she testified he had high expenses. That's where the issue was from the state's perspective, is that he had a lot of expenses. But those were not fixed expenses. His mortgage was like $3,000 a month. $36,600 a year. The vehicle leases were $25,000 if you consider that, almost $26,000 a year if you consider that a fixed expense. He liked the cars. Utilities, maybe a little under $10,000 if you add up electricity, gas, water, sewer. And then for one of his insurance companies, he had to make I guess a yearly payment, I think it was monthly, but amounted to about $5,000 a year to maintain that policy. So we're talking total fixed expenses of $76,973 approximately. Now the income from disability, if you apply a 39% tax rate, the net is $141,759. If you do the math, it leaves about $65,000 in disposable income. If you include the Audi lease, you could subtract that. It's about $10,000 a year. You're at $55,000. And that's net. And Detective Bassender, when Mr. Murray questioned her, acknowledged you can always lower your expenses if you have to. That was a concern. You can lower your expenses. Paul had that option if push come to shove. Doesn't make sense that instead of lowering his expenses, if he needed to, he would instead murder his family? Could have just sold EcoStar. He wanted to hold off. He was not desperate for money. That's not what this is about. That's what they think this is about. Now, the $78,000 from the trust also does not add up. So the state alleges that over the course of 2017 and 2018, Paul took money from the trust. Now there's, the trust itself is, a life insurance policy is maintained within that. And there's a TD trust account that's really just it's called a trust account in name, but it's really a checking account. That's what Detective Bassiter testified to. And they put money in the TD Bank account to then transfer money and make payments to the life insurance policy to maintain that policy. Now, Paul was the trustee. And the expert, Cardenas, Mr. Cardenas, he explained that Paul, being the trustee didn't require him to make those payments toward the Canada Life Insurance policy, but he could certainly be designated as that person. And the state is alleging that Paul, rather than using the money that was funded from the business into the TD Trust account to pay the life insurance policy premiums, that instead he was taking the money. Now, assuming that is true, Paul was paying it back. You heard testimony that from Stephen Weinstein that it's a family business. There was money constantly flowing in and out of accounts. Keith and Paul are paying money into the company, their own personal money. The company is paying money back to them. The company paid money into the trust, and the trust paid money back into the company. There's money flowing all sorts of ways, and Detective Bassiter kind of, again, it was a lengthy testimony, but that's